A looming humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan is raising concerns among world leaders. On Tuesday, an emergency meeting of representatives of the 20 biggest economies discussed aid for the war-ravaged country, as well as ensuring safe passage for thousands of Western-allied Afghans. But China and Russia disagree with other G20 members on how to approach the country's multiple crises. And as Mobin Nasir reports, reaching consensus on how to help Afghanistan's most vulnerable may not be easy.
Selling vegetables under the sweltering sun in Kabul is never easy, but nowadays Muhammad Khan is really feeling the heat.
Under the previous government, people used to buy lots of vegetables, but now there aren't many customers. Sometimes my cart remains full of unsold vegetables that rot or go bad.
Potential customers like Ajmal Khan say they can no longer afford food and other necessities because they haven't been paid.
Many of my colleagues have lost their jobs. Our salaries haven't been paid by the government and we're living in poverty.
The Afghan government is broke. 75% of public spending in the country came from international aid. Those disbursements were halted when the Taliban took over on August the 15th. Western nations that had provided most of this money have yet to establish diplomatic ties with the Taliban and aren't keen to fund the group. The UN says that's driving the country into a humanitarian disaster. It estimates that at least 18 million Afghans are affected by the cash crunch. 3.2 million children are suffering from acute malnutrition, and more than 2,000 healthcare facilities have shut down. The UN says at least $600 million in emergency aid is needed within the next few months to provide food, clothing and shelter for the most vulnerable members of the population. On Tuesday, the EU increased its aid package for Afghanistan to $1.2 billion. Just under a quarter of this will be spent on humanitarian assistance in the country, while the rest will be provided to neighboring nations hosting Afghan refugees. The UN Secretary General has called for pledges to be followed by a quick disbursement of funds.
I urge the world to take action and inject liquidity into the Afghan economy to avoid collapse. I'm not saying that I'm asking the international community to give money to the Taliban. The questions of recognition and the questions of dealing with government are totally different.
His appeal came just before an emergency G20 session where leaders discussed humanitarian assistance and security concerns. China and Russia are at odds with Western countries over how to provide economic support. They're calling for the lifting of sanctions on the Taliban and the Afghan government, a move opposed by the US, EU and others. Unless world leaders can put aside their differences, millions of Afghans could pay the ultimate price. Mobin Nasir, TRT World.
Well, for more on this, Torek Farhadi joins me from Geneva. He's a former economic advisor to the Afghan government. Torek, the US and some other nations have always said that any financial aid comes with preconditions. Is it time for countries to put that sort of rhetoric behind them when we see that the humanitarian crisis is getting so serious?
Well, it's difficult because when wealthy nations make pledges of their taxpayers' monies, they have to be able to explain to their taxpayers to whom it's sent and how it's spent. The Taliban, who say they have won the war against the US and NATO, might be on the verge of losing the war in preventing a crisis in Afghanistan, an economic crisis, a crisis of hunger. The Taliban is an ideological group, but now it is their responsibility to adjust themselves to what the wealthy nations want in order to help Afghanistan, because Afghanistan is not a wealthy country. It needs this help. So most of the donors for Afghanistan are Western countries, European countries, and the United States. They are the ones who are putting their money up front to save Afghanistan from hunger. They have conditions on human rights, on women's rights, on a larger government where other Afghans can be seen, whereas now there's only Taliban in the government.
You say that the Taliban is an ideology, an ideological government. What confidence do you have then that they will be able to manage the economy going forward?
This is the difficulty. As an ideological government, they have trouble bringing experts who are not subscribing to their ideology, but are Afghans, experts, and can help the country, can make a bridge between the country and the international community. Today, we are in a difficult situation where the international community, the G20, is meeting about Afghanistan, and there is no representative of Afghanistan at the table because for the wealthy countries, they are not recognized. The Taliban are not recognized as the legitimate government of Afghanistan. It is very easy for Taliban to fix this by enlarging the government and by saying that human rights and women's rights are respected in Afghanistan and opening the girls' schools, for instance. But they are sort of in their own world. They say everybody should be thankful that we freed Afghanistan from Westerners. This is not enough. This is not enough. And now Afghanistan is in a fight against poverty, hunger, hundreds of thousands of people having to take refuge in neighboring countries. And as you can see, the international community dedicates most of the money it has been pledged today to neighboring countries because they expect that refugees will go to neighboring countries. When the Secretary General of the UN is talking about possible collapse in diplomatic language, it means that he already sees collapse coming in Afghanistan.
Torek, we're running out of time, but if you could just really briefly give me what your opinion is on where this money should be best directed. Where's it going to make the most impact?
Well, the ideal case would be for this money to go to the poor in Afghanistan so that the poor doesn't have to move out of the country. Right now, the way it is explained is that it is going to go to neighboring countries so they can contain a wave of refugees. In every country neighboring Afghanistan, then Turkey, then Greece, then everyone, Europe, they're all concerned about a wave of refugees out of Afghanistan, out of poverty, not having food. People will have to leave. So in order for this money to be well spent, it has to go inside Afghanistan. In order to go inside Afghanistan, the Taliban have to make themselves acceptable to all the Afghans and acceptable to the international community.
And that's going to be the hardest part. We're going to have to leave it there. Torek Farhadi, thank you so much for your input. Always appreciated here on Money Talks.